Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm Drew James from Liverpool. I've walked with various protest marches in Liverpool and London since the 70s. Back in the summers of 2020 and 21, I walked with Stop HS2 activists along the Western HS2 route between London and Wigan. Then, late in September 2021, joined the Faithbridge Camino to COP26, a mind-bending action designed to drive change by triggering an emotional response from those we encountered. This talk started out as an explanation of why I joined the Camino, but it now goes on to look at marches and pilgrimages of the past, and to ask if pilgrimage can be both an expression of faith and a tool for protest. I've posted some questions in the chat. I hope you can see those. Maybe someone can repost them for me for those who've joined later. But first, let's go back 60 years. Age 10, I loved Crusaders. It was a children's Bible class with a badge modelled on Ephesians 6, exhorting us to stand our ground and put on the full armour of God, the belt of truth, the breastplate of righteousness, the gospel of peace, the shield of faith, the helmet of salvation, and the sword of the Spirit. The military references appeal to children. Our parents had come back from the war, and school wall charts still had large parts of the globe tinted pink. Each summer, I was excited to go away on crew camp for a week, sleeping on bags of straw in bell tents by the seaside. My parents must have despaired when a few years later, I became an ardent born-again Christian and condemned their agnosticism. As a teenage evangelical, I came across views that Catholicism was a corruption of our faith and the Pope was an antichrist. It was the sin of idolatry to pray to Mary or worship the shrine of a saint. I never got to witness a pilgrimage or to understand what truly was going on. Here we see a gathering of pilgrims approaching the shrine of Our Lady of Walsingham. From the absence of backpacks and their attire, I guess they've been walking just for that day, and it's not been raining, but you can see how preciously the symbols of faith are carried. The woman praying with her beads, the lips chanting, the certainty and serenity of their movement. Pilgrimages feature in most religions, and by Chaucer's time, they were a big deal in Christendom. In the first stanza of the Canterbury Tales, he gives a beautiful description of April, the spring that has inspired a universal feeling. The April shower, added with the fragrance, is carried by the west wind, and the music produced by the little birds seems to intrigue the people to go on a pilgrimage. Indeed, the prospect of adventure, discovery, and education was a strong motivation for doing so. For just about everybody, it was the only way to leave the village in safety of numbers and see the world, staying at inns and religious houses. Here on the left, we see a priest with wealthy companions on horseback, and on the right, there are peasants on foot. One appears to be praying, or is he clapping while his mate from Crosby Ravensworth plays the bagpipes? Apart from adventure, a common reason for pilgrimage was the echoes it gave of the journey of Christ. A clear destination would be in mind, usually the shrine of a saint, where relics were held and venerated as a source of spiritual energy. Pilgrimages were often made with special requests in mind. Many a pilgrimage was made to escape the plague or to ask for safety from it. Sometimes a pilgrim would pray for a cure, believing that illness was a sign of sin or was a punishment. Other pilgrimages were made in obedience to an oath made when in danger, and soldiers embarking on the Crusades would journey to a shrine to pray for safety. The Church took the power to grant pardons or indulgences for sins, saving the recipient from a fixed duration in purgatory. The sale of these indulgences at holy sites and shrines became a major source of income for the Church and was a driver for the Reformation. as the centuries passed. By the 13th century, the idea of pilgrimage as a penance for wrongdoing had developed. A bishop could impose this for a serious ecclesiastical crime, and there was a form of judicial penance whereby a criminal could be sentenced to carry out a pilgrimage. Note the pilgrim's simple dress, sometimes going barefoot, the wide-brimmed hat pinned with a scallop shell, strong staff and bag fashioned from a shawl or made of leather. The penitent here also appears to be carrying a sword, but that may be a 17th century construct as the engraving is dated 1641, 1 year before the English Civil War. Save for those on horseback, the images we have seen show that medieval pilgrims travelled light. They relied on food and shelter provided along the way. Note that one here has an embroidered cross. As well as being the price of crime, the pilgrimage could also be a way of escaping capture. As a wearer of the pilgrim's cross, the traveller was beyond the reach of the law and could not be arrested or taken to a civil court. Pilgrims returning home would have tales to tell of adventures and visions beheld. Here, perhaps suffering the deprivations of the road, our pilgrim sees a vision of saints swimming in the company of angels. Or maybe it's just his pals with water wings. In the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer's pilgrims are set a task during their journey from Southwark to Canterbury. They would tell stories along the way, much like a poetry slam, and there would be a whip round to buy dinner for the winning pilgrim. 600 years later, during the Camino to Cop, our Caministas got an opportunity most nights to say something to our host communities about what had motivated them to walk to Glasgow. In return, we were gifted with an abundance of hospitality by way of a floor for our bedrolls and delicious vegan meals. Note the jester at the table wearing rabbit ears. How bizarre is that? Or inspired, perhaps? Pilgrimage ended in England and Wales with the dissolution of the monasteries. Henry VIII ordered the destruction of shrines and stole all the goods which they had amassed. While this was going on, a Catholic rebellion styled as the Pilgrimage of Grace was got up by Robert Aske and marched on York. Henry promised to listen to their demands, so they went home. Henry then had Aske and the other leaders executed. So here's a tip: don't do a pilgrimage when tooled up with weapons. Sorry, just pausing for a moment there, just to get the right spot in my notes here. In the 21st century, aspects of the medieval idea of pilgrimage has been revived by bucket list culture, another challenge, testing physical and mental endurance along with sightseeing and bonhomie along the way, an opportunity to follow in the steps of TV and sporting personalities, roughing it in Spain and Italy. Meanwhile, back in 1678, pilgrimage was being rebooted by John Bunyan as a Calvinist spiritual journey. While in Crusaders, my class was taught about the Pilgrim's Progress, illustrated with colour slides. Christian leaves the city of destruction, bottom left of your screen there, carrying a heavy burden of sin. After falling into the slough of despair and wandering from the straight and narrow path, and aided by Evangelist, he kneels at Calvary's cross, where the bonds of sin loosen and fall away. Thereafter, Bunyan's allegory depicts the trials and temptations of the Christian's life, but it was that image of the burden of sin which struck me most as a child. During the Camino last year, it was ironic to find myself walking in the kingdom of heaven, but now, literally, with a flipping great weight firmly on my back. Unfortunately, modern retellings of Pilgrim's Progress have cast Christian as action hero and bulked him up to carry an even more humongous pack of sin, but in reality, hidden away in Liverpool, Christian is busily restoring and recreating. Why did I join a 500-mile trek to Glasgow? Well, there was the physical challenge of walking hundreds of miles and a curiosity for places as yet unseen, and the fun of being part of a wandering band in appalling weather. But more than that, I wanted to see the impact of the climate emergency on the people who lived and worked along our route. The monetarization of Earth's bounty has driven humanity into an existential crisis. Our way of life is out of kilter with our values and with species survival. When I first saw this image, I thought it was just a piece of artwork for a science fiction novel, but it's an actual photograph. In response to this, the Camino to COP26 traversed that thin place where the spiritual and physical worlds collide. We walked as an act of prayer, immersed in the landscape, meditating on the human condition, made in the image of our Creator. The Camino to COP26 was a faith journey, truly a pilgrimage, but with a difference. Like pilgrims of old, our prayer was for healing, not for ourselves, but for our sick planet. Prayer gives agency to be the healing that we crave. And so we brought to Glasgow the coat of hopes, a physical manifestation of the hopes and prayers of those we encountered on the way. Many of you will by now have met the coat and maybe worn it for a while and felt the weight of messages lovingly embroidered there. The one on the top right is mine. This is a video I'm going to play. Here we are gathered singing the Coat of Hope song before going out into our daily timeout of silent walking.
Is it that I'm taking to the ones who will decide if as the world will do all in our power to survive? I collected on my path with griefs or prayers, remembrances of the land through which we passed. Ask me where going. Ask me what is my purpose. Ask me what my name is. They call me the coat of hope. Here's my invitation, come and make me who I'll be. Come mark your hope from blanket and our souls into me. A coat that's made by everyone for everyone to wear. To fill my wound, the weight of responsibility we share. Ask me where I'm going. Ask me what is my purpose. Ask me what my name is. They call me the coat of hope. Yay! Right, let's do it.
Put simply, I had 4 reasons. Oh no, sorry, let's go back. Please would you stay muted, but read with me the declarations that we read each morning, gathered around a mandala of found items. So on the left, we are united by our faith, a faith that we can advocate and influence and be the change that we want for our world. We choose to walk to COP26 as a practice of that faith, an act of connection with the earth on which we walk and the people with whom we walk and the communities through which we pass. And we make our way in kinship with the peoples and creatures of the earth who are suffering and displaced by climate and ecological breakdown. We do so peacefully and lawfully, ready to engage and learn, because we care and we have hope. Our journey to Glasgow is rooted in the daily practice of love and respect, both when we are planning and organising the Camino and when we undertake it. This regenerative practice means listening actively, especially to those we will meet each day on the way and at our daily destinations. It also means listening to nature in the lands and landscapes that we love so ferociously, hearing her in town and country, hearing her groans as she struggles to be heard, hearing her triumphs as she bodies forth life. Put simply, I had 4 reasons for walking the Camino to COP26. The adventures of the road, a prayer for healing of this earth, an act of penitence for my own conduct, and lastly, a demand for penitence from those who hold power in this world for the damage wrought to creation and the sufferings of those most impacted across the globe. What you can't see in this image is exhausted Caministas catching some rest by the side of a motorway. Being on the Camino entailed a huge sacrifice for many who walked, and I think in particular of those who were separated from partners and children for many weeks. It was tough going, not without cost. 4 days out from Glasgow, we were stopped by 2 busloads of Scottish public order police. They asked if we needed any help, as if we might be lost. They declined to wear the coat, but were given no mercy by Barbara Keel, who calmly explained its destination and purpose and how it was conceived as a means to generate an emotional response from the wearer. This was the mystery of the coat. It spoke to the heart. In a moment, I'm going to play you a video clip made on the day we entered Glasgow. And then I'll go on briefly to look at examples of other activist pilgrimages. Still well up when I see some of these images. The Camino ended at Glasgow Green, a park a little way out from the city centre. The Coat of Hopes, however, carried on for 12 days with a daily march to the COP26 Blue Zone gates. It became like a holy relic, an object of veneration with a liturgy of its own, with a vanguard bearing a simple banner and beating a drum, and attendants reverently supporting its weight. It became transfigured, connecting this earthly world with the kingdom of heaven. In 1913, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies had nearly 100,000 members. They held a women's suffrage pilgrimage to show Parliament how many women wanted the vote. It was also done as a stand against what they saw as the militancy of the suffragettes, and so it was styled law-abiding. Pilgrims were urged to wear a uniform of white, grey, black, or navy blue coats and skirts or dresses. Hats were to be simple. There was a compulsory raffia badge and a shell, the traditional symbol of pilgrimage. Also a shoulder sash and a haversack made of bright red waterproof cloth edged with green with white lettering spelling out the route travelled, and umbrellas with green or white or red cotton covers. Most women travelled on foot, though some rode horses or bicycles, and wealthy sympathisers lent cars, carriages, or pony traps for the luggage. The intention was not that each individual should cover the whole route, but that the federations would do so collectively, visiting the people of the country in their own homes and villages to explain the real meaning of the movement. Meetings held on the way were nearly all peaceful. However, the women had to endure a great deal of abuse. One recalled, "It's difficult to feel a holy pilgrim when one is called a brazen hussy." The Times reported, quote, "The pilgrimage of the law-abiding advocates of votes for women ended in a great gathering in Hyde Park, attended by some 50,000 persons. The proceedings were quite orderly and devoid of any untoward incident. The proceedings, indeed, were as much a demonstration against militancy as one in favour of women's suffrage. Many bitter things were said of the militant women." That's the end of that quote. On the right there, you see the statue of Emeline Pankhurst in St. Peter's Square, Manchester, which we visited when on the Camino. And there also on the left, you see some photographs of her arrest in 1914. And then on the extreme left, those are images from the law-abiding suffragist pilgrimage. "13 years later, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom marched with others on the Peacemakers' Pilgrimage in the summer of 1926. This photograph was taken in North Wales, so you can tell it was summertime from the clothes they're wearing. The 7 main routes to London were planned to follow those taken by the Suffrage Pilgrimage back in 1913. 1,000 meetings were held in towns and villages along the way. That's impressive. A model declaration was shared in the press. "We, members and supporters of the Peacemakers' Pilgrimage, believing that law should take the place of war in the settlement of international disputes, urge His Majesty's government to agree to submit all disputes to conciliation or arbitration, and by taking the lead in the proposed disarmament conference of the League of Nations, to show that Great Britain does not intend to appeal to force." What do you think of these images? Contrast with those we've already seen and later. Let's play this. Oh, sorry, got to go back. Let's try playing this. Yep. Interesting clip this. You'll see little has changed in 96 years. Say perhaps the size of hat and the absence of Gore-Tex. Bugles were sounded as the 3,000 marchers entered Hyde Park, and a resolution was put urging the government to submit all international disputes to arbitration or conciliation. Later, a delegation went to the Foreign Office. They presented Austin Chamberlain with the Pilgrimage Declaration and emphasised their object was not merely to speak of the desirability of world peace, but to put forward the need for England to throw the full weight of its immense prestige on the side of international law as against international anarchy. Chamberlain replied to the women with emollient diplomatic speak, assuring them that the government was reviewing the whole question of arbitration in international affairs. The 24-day Salt March, also known as the Salt Satyagraha, was an act of non-violent civil disobedience in colonial India, led by Mahatma Gandhi in 1930. It was a direct action campaign of tax resistance against the British salt monopoly. Another reason for this march was that the civil disobedient movement needed a strong inauguration to inspire more people to follow Gandhi's example. He started with 78 trusted volunteers. Growing numbers of Indians joined along the 239-mile route. When Gandhi broke the 1882 salt laws by making salt himself once they had arrived at the beach, it sparked large-scale acts of civil disobedience by millions of Indians. Something's gone wrong here. Just I've lost my notes. One moment. Salt March and the beating by British police of hundreds of non-violent protesters received worldwide news coverage and demonstrated the effective use of civil disobedience as a technique for fighting social and political injustice. The campaign was based upon Gandhi's principle of non-violent protest called Satyagraha, which he loosely translated as truth force. Literally, it is formed from the Sanskrit words Satya, truth, and Agraha, insistence. Gandhi urged Indians to wear only hand-spun khadi and to boycott clothing imported from Britain. Khadi wear, which was mostly white, became a symbol of self-rule. Many people at this time started to wear khadi, and it became a sign of the support for the Indian freedom struggle. The Satyagraha teachings of Gandhi and the Salt March had a significant influence on American activists such as Martin Luther King Jr. during the USA Civil Rights Movement. In 1932, with UK unemployment at nearly 3 million, the National Unemployed Workers Movement organized a great national hunger march against the means test. It numbered about 3,000 people in 18 contingents, mainly from economically depressed areas. A petition of 1 million signatures was intended to be presented to Parliament. The first contingent left Glasgow on the 26th of September and were greeted by a crowd of about 100,000 at Hyde Park on the 27th of October. That's twice the speed of our Camino last year. The marchers had not received much media publicity, but on arrival, they met an almost blanket condemnation as a threat to public order, verging upon the hysterical. Ramsay MacDonald's national government used force to stop the petition reaching Parliament, with it being confiscated by the police. Fearing disorder, the police mobilized a force of 70,000 against the marchers and their supporters. Serious violence erupted in and around the park, with mounted police being used to disperse the demonstrators, and across central London, with 75 people badly injured. After the shooting of an African-American demonstrator in 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Council planned a massive protest march from Selma to Montgomery, 54 miles away. A group of 600 set out from Selma on the 7th of March, a day that would come to be known as Bloody Sunday. On one side of the racial divide was that brave column of protesters, two abreast and smartly dressed, who knew they could end the day as martyrs. On the other was the Alabama state troopers, helmeted and holstered, carrying truncheons and wearing gas masks. The protesters were rushed by troopers at the Edmund Pettus Bridge and beaten back to Selma. The brutal scene was captured on television, enraging many Americans and drawing civil rights and religious leaders of all faiths to Selma in protest. 2 days later, King led more than 2,000 marchers, black and white, across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, but found the highway blocked again by state troopers. King paused and led the marchers in prayer, whereupon the troopers stepped aside. King then turned the protesters around, believing the troopers were trying to create an opportunity to let them enforce a federal injunction prohibiting the march. 6 days later, President Johnson went on television to pledge his support to the Selma protesters and to call for the passage of a new voting rights bill. Some 2,000 people set out from Selma on the 21st of March, protected by US Army troops and Alabama National Guard forces under federal control. And after walking some 12 hours a day and sleeping in fields, they reached Montgomery on March the 25th. More so than the courage of the protesters, it was the viciousness of police that turned Selma into such a milestone. King called it the greatest confrontation so far in the South. It produced precisely the kind of violence that the non-violent black protesters relied upon to achieve major breakthroughs. Had it not been for police brutality, the civil rights movement would never have made such major strides. That's the end of this. I've got these questions here, which I hope you can see in the chat, and I'll stop sharing now so that we can have a discussion.